Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing: Global Geopolitics, Monday, August 03. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. Let me begin with a puzzle, because I think a puzzle is the honest way into where this domain now stands. Consider four things that happened within roughly a day of each other. A homemade bomb detonated outside a restaurant in central Moscow, killing 3, and the authorities declined, or were unable, to say who the target was. A cargo ship slipped through the English Channel, carrying armored personnel carriers to Mali, defying sanctions in plain view of satellites. Tens of thousands of migrants surged into a small Spanish enclave on the North African coast, a movement amplified and shaped by social media faster than any government could respond. And across several European cities, a network reportedly used teenagers as contract killers, violence sold, quite literally, as a service. Now, a casual reader of the news files these under separate headings: terrorism, sanctions, evasion, migration, organized crime. 4 folders, 4 experts, 4 segments, on 4 different programs. But I want to suggest that they are the same story wearing different costumes, and that noticing this is the single most useful thing one can do to understand the present moment. Here is the connection. In each case, the decisive actor is not a state exercising coordinated force through official channels. It is something smaller, faster, deniable, and rentable. A bomb whose author no one can name, a ship carrying a state's weapons, but under commercial cover, its ownership diffused through shells. A crowd of people mobilized by a rumor and a smartphone, arriving at a border as a political weapon whether or not anyone planned them as one. A murder committed by a 15-year-old hired through an app. The old machinery of geopolitics, the declaration, the uniform, the attributable act, is being replaced by a machinery of ambiguity. The whole point is that you cannot be sure who did it, and therefore cannot be sure how, or against whom, to respond. I'd call this the deniability economy, and it is now the dominant grammar of international friction. States have discovered that the most valuable thing they can purchase is not a weapon, but a shrug. If your adversary cannot prove it was you, they cannot retaliate without looking like the aggressor. So the frontier of power has migrated away from the visible clash of armies and toward a foggy middle ground of proxies, intermediaries, criminal networks, and manufactured crowds, a zone where causation is deliberately smudged. And this is precisely where it becomes non-obvious, because the loud, attributable, old-fashioned confrontation still exists and still dominates the headlines. Set against that Moscow bomb and that mystery ship, you have the most legible geopolitical drama imaginable: an American president publicly threatening to hit Iran hard, embassies issuing alerts. Then a sudden reversal: strikes cancelled, deal perimeters reached, all conducted at maximum volume on a public stage. Everyone knows who the actors are. Everyone can watch the escalation and the climb down in real time. It is geopolitics as theater, performed under stage lights. So the field, as it stands now, is split into 2 registers running simultaneously. There is the theater of attribution, loud, personalized, performed for domestic audiences, where the identity of every actor is the whole point. And there is the economy of deniability, quiet, diffuse, deliberately unattributable, where obscuring identity is the whole point. And here is the uncomfortable thing. The 2 are not opposites. They feed each other. The louder and more personalized the public confrontation becomes, the more attractive the deniable channel grows. Because no leader who has staked his reputation on a public posture can afford to be seen backing down, but he can afford things that no one can prove he did. You can watch this seam appear everywhere once you know to look. A wave of cyber attacks on American state governments, with the FBI unable to name a culprit, arriving just as warnings circulate about an Iranian plot. Attribution suspended precisely at the moment of maximum tension. A migration surge that chills relations between Spain and Israel, with dark speculation about whether a third party had a hand in it, and no way to prove the matter either way. The suspicion itself becomes the weapon. You don't even need to have done the thing, you merely need your rival to wonder whether you did. And notice what recedes into the background while all this plays out. A nuclear plant in Hungary forced offline because the river that cools it has run too low. Wildfires across the Mediterranean, an outbreak of Ebola held at a national border by checkpoints and luck. These are the genuinely large forces: climate, disease, the physical world pressing on the political one. And they are the least deniable things imaginable. Yet they command the least strategic attention, because no adversary can be blamed for them, and no leader can perform a victory over a drought. So that is the state of the field, and the argument I want to build. We have a world increasingly governed by two opposite instincts about identity: the compulsion to attribute and the craft of denial, while the truly consequential pressures go strategically homeless. In what follows, I want to trace how these two registers actually interact, and then ask the harder question: who, if anyone, is still keeping their eye on the things that cannot be denied? If you lay these stories side by side, the bomb outside a Moscow restaurant, the teenage assassins for hire threading their way across European borders, a sanctioned cargo ship carrying armored vehicles calmly down the English Channel, tens of thousands of people surging across a fence at Ceuta in the space of a few days, you might be tempted to file them under separate headings. One is terrorism, another organized crime, another sanctions evasion, another migration. That's how the news desk sorts them, and it's how our attention sorts them too. But I want to suggest that the tidy categories are the illusion, and that beneath them runs a single, rather uncomfortable current. The current is this: the monopoly on force and on the movement of people and goods is quietly leaking away from the states that once claimed it. That claim, that the state, and the state alone, decides who may use violence, who may cross a border, what may pass through its waters, is the founding fiction of the modern order. It was never wholly true, but it was true enough to organize the world for 3 centuries. What we are watching now is not the collapse of that fiction so much as its gradual dilution. And dilution is far harder to notice than collapse. Consider the teenage hitmen. What's remarkable about a network that outsources murder to 14-year-olds, coordinated over encrypted apps, priced like a service, is not the brutality. Brutality is old. It's the business model. Violence rendered as a subscription, procured across borders, detached from any political program or grievance. This is what happens when the capacity to kill is unbundled from the institutions that used to hoard it. The state kept violence expensive and centralized, precisely so it could remain the arbiter, make it cheap, distributed, and deniable, and the arbiter loses its grip without ever losing a battle. Now set beside that the ship slipping through the channel with military vehicles bound for the Sahel in open defiance of sanctions. Sanctions are, at bottom, an assertion of authority over flows, a rich world's insistence that it can decide what crosses which line. The vessel that simply proceeds anyway is not merely breaking a rule, it's demonstrating, in satellite imagery for anyone to see, that the rule is enforceable only where someone chooses to enforce it, and that increasingly no one does. Every unenforced prohibition is a small tuition payment in the education of everyone watching. The lesson learned is that the lines on the map are suggestions, priced accordingly. And then, Ceuta, 60,000 people crossing in days, and then, nearly all of them gone again just as fast. A floating barrier hastily installed after the fact. What that episode reveals is that a border is not a wall of steel, but a wall of consensus, and the consensus can be switched off. When a neighboring state relaxes its grip, deliberately or through exhaustion, the flow that follows exposes how much of sovereignty was always a matter of cooperation rather than control. The alarm that rippled through the whole of Europe was not really about 60,000 people. It was the sudden intuition that the machinery everyone assumed was solid runs, in truth, on somebody else's willingness to keep it running. You can even hear the same current in the loud headline diplomacy over Iran: strikes threatened, then cancelled, subject to a deal reached rapidly, embassies bracing, warnings of decisive responses. It looks like the old world of great powers deciding fates. But notice how much of it is signaling, improvisation, threats issued and withdrawn within a single news cycle. The theater of decisive state power grows louder precisely as the underlying ability to impose outcomes grows less certain. Cyber attacks on state governments, attributed to no one, investigated endlessly, that's the same phenomenon wearing a different mask. Attribution is the modern form of sovereignty, and attribution is exactly what's failing. Here is why this matters more than any single crisis. When violence, movement, and enforcement all quietly decentralize at once, the state doesn't announce its retreat. It keeps up appearances. It holds the summits, issues the statements, installs the barrier, drops the charges, files the subpoena against a journalist to remind everyone who's in charge. But the substance drains away behind the ceremony, and the danger of a hollowing that hides behind ceremony is that we mistake the ceremony for the substance right up until the moment we need the substance and find it gone. The deep current, then, is not war and not peace. It is the slow, uneven return of the world to a condition the modern state was invented to end, a condition in which force is plural, borders are porous, and the question, who decides, no longer has a single confident answer. The noise on the surface is all conflict. The current underneath is the quiet renegotiation of who gets to hold the levers at all. Hold that thought, because in a moment we'll ask what, if anything, rushes in to fill a vacuum like that. So we come to the part where we ask what all of it means. And I want to resist the easy temptation, which is to gather up a day's worth of disparate misery and pretend it forms a single tidy pattern. It doesn't. A plane goes down over the Nazca lines. An avalanche takes a celebrated climber and his clients on Broad Peak. A gunman opens fire at a burger restaurant in Idaho. These are tragedies, and they are also, in the largest sense, noise. The discipline of reading the world well is partly the discipline of knowing what not to connect. But underneath the noise there are a few signals, and those are worth naming because they tell us where the pressure is building. The first thing I'd have you watch is the way coercion is being outsourced and disguised. Consider the pattern where teenagers are recruited across Europe to carry out contract killings, violence sold as a service, murder rendered into a gig economy. Consider a bombing outside a Moscow restaurant where the authorities pointedly decline to name the target, leaving a vacuum that everyone rushes to fill with their preferred story. Consider a Russian ship slipping armored vehicles through the English Channel to Mali in open defiance of sanctions. What connects these is not a conspiracy, but a technique, the deliberate blurring of who did what to whom. States and networks alike have learned that plausible deniability is cheaper than plausible strength. When you cannot be certain who pulled the trigger, deterrence itself begins to erode because you cannot retaliate against a shrug. The second-order implication is corrosive. A world where attribution is always contested is a world where escalation becomes both easier and harder to control. Easier because you can act through proxies, harder because the other side may retaliate against the wrong actor entirely. The second signal is migration as an instrument, not merely a phenomenon. Tens of thousands of people crossing into Ceuta in a matter of days. Spain installing a floating barrier, the European Union calling an emergency meeting, and, this is the telling detail, a social media storm inflating the whole thing into something politically radioactive. Watch this carefully. Human movement is being weaponized in two directions at once. It can be encouraged or tolerated by a neighboring state as leverage, and it can be amplified, distorted, and mythologized by domestic actors who find political gold in the resulting panic. The migrants themselves, most of whom left within days, become almost incidental to the fight over what their arrival is supposed to mean. The thing to watch is not the number of crossings. It's the speed at which a border incident becomes a governing crisis. The delta between the event and the narrative. That delta is shrinking, and shrinking deltas are dangerous because they leave no time for the boring work of verification. The third, and to my mind the most consequential, is the strange choreography around Iran. Within the space of a few days, we hear that strikes are imminent, that the United States will hit hard, that embassies are bracing, that Tehran promises a decisive response, and then, abruptly, that the strikes are cancelled, subject to a deal being reached rapidly, with talk of Hormuz and disarmament and withdrawal. Meanwhile, over in Gaza, the killing continues regardless of whatever plan has just been unveiled. Now, one reading of this is relief. A war averted, diplomacy triumphant. I'd urge more caution. What we're watching is coercive bargaining conducted in public, in real time, with the threat and its withdrawal both used as instruments of pressure. The trouble with negotiating this way is that it teaches every party that words are cheap and reversible. When a strike can be promised and cancelled within days, and when the promise of a deal coexists with fresh strikes on the ground, the currency of commitment gets debased. Watch whether any of this produces a durable text, an actual agreement with mechanisms, or whether it evaporates into the next cycle of threat and pause. The mechanism is the whole game. Announcements are theatre, and there is a quieter through line beneath all three, which is climate and infrastructure pressing on the machinery of states in ways we still treat as background. Hungary, preparing to shut its only nuclear plant because the Danube has fallen too low to cool the reactors. Greece battling wildfires. These are not geopolitics in the old sense of borders and armies, but they are the ground on which the old geopolitics now has to stand, and that ground is getting less reliable. A country that cannot cool its reactors has fewer options in every other arena. So what to watch? Distilled, watch for attribution and distrust anything you cannot source. Watch the gap between an event and its meaning, and be suspicious of speed. Watch for mechanisms rather than announcements, for the boring paperwork that turns a ceasefire into a peace. The world does not announce its turning points. It leaks them quietly in the details we're tempted to skip. Our job, always, is to skip nothing that matters, and to have the humility to admit which is which. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming. We'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.